This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us on Living History, and like always, don't forget to subscribe and to review us so that you don't miss out on any of the great content we've got coming your way. And today we've got something a little bit different, but something I think you'll find very special. My guest is David Wallechinsky, who's the president of the International Society of Olympic Historians. And he's also the author of the complete book of the Olympics, both the summer and winter editions. And he's joining me today to talk about the history of the Olympic Games. So, David, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Let's begin with the story of the Olympics, the history of the Olympics, because it's quite an intriguing tale, the ancient Olympics and then its transition to the modern games that we know today. Can you tell us a little bit about how the ancient games started and how they led eventually to the modern Olympics we know today?
Sure. We know that the ancient Olympics went back at least to 776 BC. If it was before that, it's possible, but we don't have records of that. So this was in Olympia, in Greece, and it was a combination. The athletic part of it was just part of what went on. There were speeches, there was art. It was a big event. There's a myth that there was an Olympic truce, that there was no fighting going on during the Olympics. This is not true. What they did have is free passage. If two enemies were fighting, they would pause to let the participants go through their area on their way to Olympia, and then they'd start fighting again. So, this went on. It was finally bowdlerized and ended in 389 AD. It's quite a long journey. And then in the 1890s, Baron Pierre de Coubertin of France decided that he wanted to revive the Olympics, a modern version of the Olympics. Other people had done this, but he was the most persistent and the most, he was the most effective at doing this. So he called a Congress in 1894. He created an International Olympic Committee. He was pretty much it, but there were 12 other members. He felt that the first games should take place in Greece, in Athens, and money was donated by Greek citizens. And in 1896 they held the first modern games. We've had Olympics at least every 4 years since then, except for the two world wars. The 1916 Olympics were canceled, and so were the Olympics of 1940 and 44. After 1992, the International Olympic Committee changed the schedule so that it used to be, until then, that the Winter Olympics and the Summer Olympics were in the same year. But it was better for marketing to separate them, so starting in 1994, they had a separate Winter Olympics, and ever since then, we've had one 4-year cycle for the Winter Olympics and another 4-year cycle for the Summer Olympics.
Paint us a bit of a picture of what those ancient games would have looked like. What sort of events were taking place? How much does it relate to the modern Olympics we see today?
It's pretty different, except for the sprint. I mean, you can go, anybody can go there now and run on the same course that they ran. It's 192 meters. And I've certainly run it, and so have, thousands and thousands of other people. Then they started adding other events. There was boxing, there was pankration, which was kind of like mixed martial arts. Then as it got corrupted, there was chariot racing and all sorts of odd things. But the very beginning was running, just like now,
Was the intention of the ancient Olympics the same sort of noble purpose it is today, to bring competitors together from all corners and to compete to be fastest, strongest, quickest? Was that the intention of the ancient games as well?
Yes, it was very much that. It was beyond sport, but the sport was big, and you could, if you won, one of the championships in the ancient Olympics, you would never have to pay for your ouzo for the rest of your life back home, and so it was a big deal. And these athletes, I've been amused that people go, why can't we go back to the amateur code like they had in ancient Greece? These guys didn't do anything but train. They were practically professionals. There's a lot of consistency in the way it was then and the way it is now.
And since the modern Olympics began, David, how have we seen that competition evolve? Because the Olympics of 1896 must have looked fairly different to the ones we see today. How have things changed over the century?
Well, back in 1896, there were no national teams. You showed up and you competed. The 1900 and 1904 Olympics were disastrous because they were appended to World's Fairs. 1900 in Paris and 1904 in St. Louis, the United States. So the Greeks requested and got permission to hold what was known as the intercalated games, the interim games in 1906 in Athens. And that actually revived the games. And then finally, 1908, you had the games in London, and it became a bigger deal. And there were a couple, one story in particular was told around the world, even when it was just journalism, and that was the dramatic ending of the marathon, where Laurento Pietri of Italy entered the stadium first and collapsed and had to be dragged. He had to be hauled up, which at that time was illegal. And so when the American, Johnny Hayes, entered, the Americans immediately filed a protest and won. Pietri and Hayes then, launched, like an international tour of, one-on-one marathons. And so the Olympics became much more well-known. And by the time you had, say, the 1924 Olympics in Paris, all of a sudden there were reporters from all over the world covering it. It was a bigger deal. It's developed, the sports have changed dramatically since then. Back in the early days, of course, running has always been there. Wrestling has always been there. But in some of the early games, there were things like the plunge for distance, or the swimming obstacle race, or the high jump on horseback. So these things, and actually polo was in several Olympics.
How far do you think we'd have to go back, David, to see an Olympic Games that is fairly representative of what we see today?
You have media. The big difference is media. Back then you didn't have television. There was a certain amount of, in 1936, when the games were in Berlin, the Nazi Olympics, they were shown on open screens in different cities in Germany. And, that was the first attempt to have a mass audience. Now you have to say that, 98% of the people who follow the Olympics do so on television or online. And so it's a very different perception of what you want. The next Olympics, a year from now, will be in Tokyo, 2020. And they are going to be probably during a heat wave, which is not very good for athletes. But it was demanded by television. This is what we want. And since most people watch on television, that took precedent over, the heat. The last time Tokyo hosted the Olympics, 1964, they held them in October when it was cool.
I remember that from when the Olympics were held in Sydney in 2000. There were real issues with the broadcasters with event timings, trying to beam them back to North America and Europe at a sensible time. Do you think in your opinion, has that tarnished somewhat the noble nature of the Olympics, that it's now so beholden to these media giants?
When you get to the athletes, and there'll be 10,000, 11,000 athletes at the Tokyo Olympics, they don't care about that. They just want to do the best they can. And whether it's covered on TV or, whether they finish in the lower half, doesn't matter. They just want to get their personal record. They want to do their best. And, we watch on television and all the emphasis is on the medal winners. But the fact is that probably 2/3, maybe even 3/4 of the athletes in the Olympics know that they're not going to win a medal, but they're going to be there anyway, and they're going to do their best. NBC, the U.S. television network, supplies half of the revenue for the International Olympic Committee. And if you put all the broadcasters together, it's 70%. So clearly they have a lot of power.
You mentioned the athletes and their desire to achieve and to do the best they can. It seems to me that over the years, that's one thing that hasn't changed. There does seem to be a high standard set amongst those athletes, and a very noble standard, notwithstanding a few controversies we've had over the years. But all in all, this seems to be a human endeavour where people are genuinely striving for greatness and delighted to be participating. In your research, have you seen that about the Olympics, that's carried through in the modern time?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, everybody wants to do their best. What you've seen is an expansion in the different kinds of sports that are included. I'm a fan of track and field athletics, because it's the universal sport. Almost everybody in the world at one point in their lives has tried to run 100 meters. Very few people have tried to swim 200 meters using the breaststroke, or competed in luge, or some of these new sports that they're adding now, rock climbing. These are obscure. They're for television, and it's to get the youth audience. But, having met a lot of these athletes, they're just as motivated as anybody else.
We mentioned medal winners. Let's talk specifically about the medals, because they're an Olympic gold. It's just iconic as an item, as a reward for success. Talk to me about the importance of the medals. I assume that over the years the medals have changed in what's presented and how they're presented. Talk to me a little bit about the medals, what they symbolise, and how they've evolved over the years.
Well, sure. You didn't really get medals until 1904, and of course that was pretty early. And it's gold for first, silver for second, and bronze for third. It means a lot. The composition of the medals has changed. It's up to the organizing committee of the games to create the medals. I think for Tokyo we'll be seeing recycled materials. This is because the International Olympic Committee is making a big push right now for what they call sustainability. And part of that is making the medals out of something useful, that can be reused, or using reused materials. It used to be in the early days, right up through the 1920s, that I watched all of the official films of the Olympics going back to 1912 and wrote reviews of them. And I was quite fascinated in the medal giving, that in the early days, the king or, whoever was the most powerful member of the royal family would stand on a dais, and the athletes would come up and he would lean down, give them a wreath, hand them the medal, like that. Now fortunately that has changed. It's the athletes who are, the medal givers look up to them. And I think this is a good change.
Talk to me about, in our notes before this interview, we talked about some unexpected medal winners. And I think reading through some of these things you put here in your book as well, it's actually quite surprising that just the breadth of people that have gone to the Olympics and done really well. Tell us about some of the unexpected medal winners, such as the Chicago socialite who won the 9-hole golf competition in 1900. Tell us about that.
Oh, well, in the 1900 Olympics, they had ladies golf. This was the beginning of women's athletics. And, Margaret Abbott, she didn't even know she had competed in the Olympics. She took part in this golf tournament and won. It was just in 1900, 1904, it was not such a big deal because it was subsumed in the World's Fair. By the time you got to 1908, then it was a big deal. People knew they were in the Olympics. But yet, again, in the days before television, you'd have a situation like Percy Williams, who won 100 meters and 200 meters in the 1920s. And, he went out for a walk and he saw a crowd around the hotel. And he asked, what's everybody doing? And they went, oh, we're waiting for Percy Williams to show up. And, he got a good kick out of that. He didn't tell them who he was. So, yeah, media has changed everything.
David, what are those iconic moments to you in all the research you've done of more than 100 years of modern Olympics? What are those moments that really stand out? Obviously, I'm thinking about things like Jesse Owens standing up to Hitler in 1936. But what are those for you, those key moments that are really the most emotional representations of the Olympics?
Some of the iconic moments in the Olympics don't actually have to do with the competition. You have the Black Power salute of 1968, John Carlos, Tommy Smith, Peter Norman. This was that photo of them with their heads bowed and their clenched fists in the air. That's just beyond the Olympics. It was an iconic photo, period. And so, these things, they go beyond. And you mentioned Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens, the 1936 Olympics were held in Nazi Germany. And they, the Nazis had, the Nazi leadership had sent out, the Americans, they can't compete against us without their black auxiliaries. That's the way they put it. And so, then Jesse Owens shows up, he wins 4 gold medals. But more important than that was that a German long jumper, Luz Long, befriended Jesse Owens publicly on the field with all the cameras running and people watching. He helped Jesse Owens, said, why don't you start with... Jesse Owens almost didn't qualify for the final because he fouled twice. And Luz Long said, listen, you're so good, you can start, put your mark or a foot, what we would call a foot, behind and start from there. And Luz Long made a point of congratulating Jesse Owens, of being photographed with him. He was a blonde, blue-eyed Aryan. And yet here he was friending Jesse Owens. And it is interesting to note also, since you did bring up Jesse Owens, that as much as the Nazis were, belittling the black athletes, the African-American athletes, that the German people loved them. And Jesse Owens couldn't even leave his room without German people asking for his autograph. So there is this symbol of the Olympics bringing people together.
It's just one of the great stories of the Olympics and you mentioned Lutz Long, and he was then obviously killed in Sicily in 1943, yes. And I visited his grave on the island. Yeah. It's just such a symbolic story that not just Jesse Owens doing brilliantly and winning medals in the Olympics, but also that relationship between him and Lutz Long. Just again, it's the Olympics bringing out the best in people, and I hope I'm not being too naive when I say that, but it is one of the few events we see in the modern world that does tend to literally bring people together.
I agree, and one of my favorite moments, which often gets overlooked, is the Parade of Nations at the opening ceremony, when you have people from every country in the world standing in one place at the same time, whereas the United Nations is the elite of these countries. These are people who, just for one reason or another, are good at a sport. And so it's this mixture. There's poor people, there's rich people, there's tall people, there's short people, every race. It's just a wonderful moment or series of moments, the opening ceremonies.
How do you feel about some of the competitors we've had who were potentially less than skilled compared to people from other countries? I'm thinking of things like Eddie the Eagle in the Winter Olympics, and Eric the Eel during the Sydney Games was a swimmer who did his best but wasn't particularly skilled. How do you? I've heard both sides of the argument that the Olympics should be held to a high standard, and we shouldn't have these people in there. And the opposite side of the scale is people saying it inspires everyone to participate and to do their best. Where do you stand on that whole discussion?
Well, there's even another argument for including people like that. Maybe not Eric the Eel, but which is that they get exposed to higher quality. Some of these people come from a country where there is no training. There are no training facilities. And then, I interviewed, one of my jobs is that for the International Olympic Committee Museum in Switzerland, I conduct video interviews with athletes who are now older than 80. And I interviewed Mary de Sousa, who was the first woman to represent India in the Olympics. She was a sprinter. And, she got there and, she was in awe. She got to see Fanny Blenkerskoen, who was unbelievable. But more to the point, Americans like Harrison Dill, the great Olympic athletes from the United States, came up to her and said, "Where are your starting blocks?" And she said, "What's a starting block?" She didn't know about that. They would just dig a hole in the ground. And so the Americans donated a starting block to Mary de Sousa. And, 70 years later, she still has it.
Just wonderful stories. David, what do you think the future of the Games is? In this complicated world of sponsorships and television and potential drug scandals, is the Olympics going to be able to maintain its reputation as this most noble sporting event? Is it still going to be important and relevant to people in the future? What do you feel about that?
Well, I think one of the things that the Olympics has going for it is that if you have 310 events, you're seeing the championship in 300 events. The only sports we are not seeing the best are boxing and football, soccer. In every other sport, in every event, it's like, 300 world championships, in a 2-week period. And you frankly don't know who's going to win. It's not scripted like so much of television. So there's always surprises. I think there's a lot of bad things about the Olympics. But I think it's, certainly the sponsors go over the top and the doping is outrageous. I think what the Russians got away with is scandalous. But at the same time, I think we make a mistake by only emphasizing the negative aspects.
Well, David, thank you so much for your time. It's been a really wonderful overview, especially since we're only a year out from the next Olympics. It's always the time when I think myself and everyone starts to get a bit excited when we lead up to the next Olympics coming up. And if anyone wants to hear more of your fantastic stories and the history of the Olympics, they should definitely pick up your book, which is the complete book of the Olympics. But David, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.